Coming off a big victory against Amazon, Bernie Sanders has released a new bill that goes directly after Wall Street. So, this from the Washington Post. Sanders' bill would bar financial institutions from holding assets, derivatives, and other forms of borrowing worth more than 3% of the entire U.S. economy, or $584 billion in today's dollars. The legislation would force federal regulators to break up 6 different Wall Street firms: JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, as well as insurance giants such as Prudential Financial and MetLife. Collectively, the targeted firms hold more than $13 trillion in assets, according to Sanders' aides. Sanders touts the plan as a way to prevent a repeat of the financial crisis of a decade ago, when banks on the edge of collapse were large enough that their failures would rock the fundamentals of the global financial system. In response, the federal government extended the banks massive loans, a move largely credited with blunting the crisis, but also gave government funding to wealthy individuals at a time when unemployment was soaring and thousands were losing their homes. Quote, "We spent huge amounts of money bailing them out, and they are significantly larger now than they were back then," Sanders said in an interview. "It's time we return to that discussion, especially now for the 10th anniversary of the crash." So once again, Bernie Sanders is leading on an issue that needs to be dealt with. Now, in this case, I don't expect JP Morgan or Citigroup or any of these other Bank of America, Wells Fargo, to self-regulate here. I don't expect them to break themselves up in the same way that Amazon answered to the pressure from Bernie and other groups by raising their wages. So in the case of banks here, in the case of Wall Street, there is no self-regulation. You have to actually force these banks to make these real changes. Now, here's more from Bernie on Twitter. "The 4 largest banks in this country, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, are on average 80% larger today than they were before we bailed them out. If these banks were too big to fail 10 years ago, what would happen if any of them were to fail today?" So once again, Bernie Sanders hitting on a note of truth here that no other senator, except for maybe Elizabeth Warren, has touched on. So it bothers me when people say, when I hear the hate percents, the Hillary, whatever, the establishment Democrats, talk about, oh, Bernie Sanders, he hasn't gotten anything done. Bernie is the only guy actually pushing through or pushing on these issues. And he was known as the Amendment King. He has done a lot, but he has to attach his legislation onto other bills because he's not going to be able to pass a bill like this on his own without the proper support in the Senate and in the House. And when you have an entire Democratic Party that is bought off by Wall Street, it's kind of hard to properly regulate them. So to criticize Bernie when he has a real critique and some actual solutions on how to fix these issues, it bothers me. But luckily, Bernie does have some outside support from experts in this area. This legislation cuts to the heart of the matter by putting a size cap on the largest highly leveraged firms. The size cap is simple, straightforward, and transparent, said Simon Johnson, an economist at MIT who served as chief economist of the International Monetary Fund and supports the bill. This measure will bring us closer to full and fair competition in the financial system, where a few megabanks currently predominate. So, look, this is an area where you're not going to have a lot of support in the Democratic Party, especially in the Senate. You just aren't, because to get in the Senate, a lot of these Democrats had to take a lot of Wall Street money. But this is an issue where if, let's say, a Bernie Sanders became president, he would then be able to hammer this home and actually get Democrats, I would hope, on board with the power of the presidency and the people behind him. So that's something that we haven't really seen, at least recently. We don't know what it would be like to have a president like a Bernie Sanders trying to push real progressive legislation through if there is still opposition towards him from other Democrats in the House and in the Senate, even though the people are behind him. So how that whole dynamic would work, it's hard to really know. But regardless of all that, this is an actual bill that deals with a serious issue. Now, let me make this comparison to Canada. So, oftentimes Americans do this thing where they don't look outside their own borders. They don't go and think, hey, how is Canada doing healthcare? How are the Europeans working on healthcare? How about banking? What's Canada doing with banking? Were the banks in Canada also collapsing in 2008? Let me give you some actual facts on that. When European and North American banks teetered on the brink of a meltdown in 2008, requiring bailouts and extraordinary central bank intervention, Canadian banks escaped relatively unscathed. History explains why, according to co-authors Michael Bordeaux, Angela Reddish, and Hugh Rockoff, in Why Didn't Canada Have a Banking Crisis in 2008, or in 1930, or 1907, or ... Starting in the 19th century, Canada and the United States took divergent paths. Canada set up a concentrated banking system that controlled mortgage lending and investment banking under the watchful eye of a single strong regulator. The United States allowed a weak, fragmented system to develop, with far more small and less stable banks, along with a shadow banking system of less regulated securities markets, investment banks, and money market funds overseen by a group of competing regulators. The contrast is striking. While in 2008 and 2009, the United States experienced bank failures, bailouts, and the worst recession since the 1930s, Canada had no bank failures, no bailouts, and its recession was less severe than either that of the early 1980s or the early 1990s. Long before 2008 in the United States, there were the failures of the private investment bank Jay Cooke & Co., the Knickerbocker Trust, and the runs on the banks that deepened the Great Depression. Although Canada's economy suffered a collapse equally as dramatic as America's in the 1930s, not one of its banks failed. And I'm going to link to that article below my video, as there is a lot more to read here. Now, clearly there is a difference between how Canada deals with banking and how Americans do. We have one strong regulator, and the US has this fragmented system. Now, obviously there is, a lot more detail to it than just that, but it shows you once again how Americans, at least politicians, don't look outside their own borders. Whether it's on banking, whether it's on healthcare, whether it's on workers' rights, all these issues where you could look to other countries and see, hey, how are they doing things? How could we maybe improve our system by looking at how they're doing it? Americans don't do that. It's a mindset. And yes, I understand, of course, big money is a huge issue with both Democrats and Republicans. I get that. But it's not even just the politicians. I feel like it's an issue with American citizens as a whole. There is this sort of this mindset where you don't look outside your own borders. And I don't get it. So, especially on issues like this, where there's 100 years of history on this, showing that Canada doesn't have their banks collapse, but America consistently does. Or on healthcare, where every other country has a universal system, but Americans still don't. And there are still even liberal Americans trying to argue how a Medicare for all system doesn't make any sense. All you have to do is look outside yourselves, because maybe you'll discover that you can actually learn something. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button below and consider becoming a patron at therationalnational.com/join. You get some extra content, but also, most importantly, you help support me in continuing to produce these sorts of videos.